The stranger in the sand. The desert stretched endlessly, its golden dunes shimmering under the unforgiving sun. Luke pulled his scarf tighter around his face, shielding himself from the hot, dry wind that bit at his skin. He had been wandering for days, searching for something, anything, to break the monotony of the barren landscape. His water supply was running low, and the mirages playing tricks on his eyes didn't help. But then, something unusual caught his attention. Far in the distance, a strange metallic glint reflected the sunlight. Luke squinted, unsure if it was another trick of the desert heat. Curiosity, however, won over caution. With a deep breath, he adjusted his pack and trudged toward the mysterious object. As he got closer, his heart began to race. The glint wasn't an object but a person, or at least it looked like one. A figure lay motionless in the sand, half buried under a layer of dust. Their skin shimmered faintly, like polished silver, and their clothing was unlike anything Luke had ever seen, smooth, seamless, and glowing faintly at the edges. "Hey," Luke called out, his voice cracking from thirst. "Are you alive?" The figure didn't move. Luke knelt beside them, brushing sand away from their face. To his shock, the person was a woman, tall and strikingly alien. Her features were sharp yet graceful, her eyes closed as if in deep sleep. Luke hesitated, unsure what to do. He had never encountered anything like this before. Was she even alive? He placed 2 fingers on her neck, searching for a pulse. For a moment, nothing. Then, a faint vibration, almost like a hum, resonated beneath her skin. Relief flooded through him. "You're alive," he muttered, more to himself than to her, but barely. Luke rummaged through his pack, pulling out his last water flask. He hesitated again. His water was running out, and he didn't know how much longer he could survive in the desert. But looking at her, helpless and vulnerable, he couldn't just walk away. "Here goes nothing," he whispered, tilting the flask to let a few drops of water fall onto her lips. Her eyes snapped open instantly, glowing a piercing blue. Luke stumbled back, nearly dropping the flask. The woman's gaze was intense, her eyes darting around as if assessing her surroundings. Then they locked onto him. "Who are you?" she said, her voice low and melodic, but strained. Luke," he stammered, still trying to process what was happening. "I found you out here. You looked, well, half dead." She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her side. Luke noticed a dark, viscous liquid oozing from a wound on her torso. It wasn't blood. At least, not any kind he'd ever seen. "You're hurt," he said, pointing to the injury. "I can help, but you need to stay still." "No," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "They'll find me if I stay here." "Who's they?" Luke asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she scanned the horizon, her expression hardening. Luke sighed, realizing he wasn't going to get any answers right now. He pulled a small medkit from his pack and began cleaning her wound. She flinched at first, but didn't protest. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, trying to lighten the tension. "I mean, that's pretty obvious." She gave him a sideways glance, her lips curling into what might have been a smirk. "What gave it away?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Luke chuckled nervously. Well, the glowing skin and alien clothes were a big hint. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the way her body seemed to radiate a faint warmth, even in the scorching desert. Her skin wasn't like anything he'd ever touched. Smooth, almost metallic, yet soft. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. She hesitated before answering. "Zira." "Zira," he repeated. "Well, Zira, you're lucky I found you. The desert isn't exactly forgiving." "I wasn't lost," she said, her voice sharp despite her condition. "I was ambushed." "Ambushed," Luke repeated, frowning. "By who?" Her eyes flicked to the horizon again, her expression unreadable. "You wouldn't understand." Before Luke could press her further, A low, rumbling growl echoed through the air. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. A dark shape moved in the distance, kicking up a cloud of sand as it approached. "What is that?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira's eyes narrowed. Trouble. The creature was massive, its silhouette growing larger with every passing second. It moved with a predatory grace, and Luke felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. "You need to run," Zira said, her voice suddenly urgent. "Now." "What about you?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. Zira forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly but steadying herself. "I'll handle it." Luke stared at her in disbelief. "You can barely stand." She turned to him, her glowing eyes fierce. "Leave, human. This isn't your fight." Before he could argue, the creature let out a deafening roar, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Luke knew he had a choice: run and save himself, or stay and help this mysterious alien woman who clearly wasn't as helpless as she seemed. As the beast closed in, Luke tightened his grip on his pack. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. Zira raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise flashing across her face. "Then try not to get yourself killed." And with that, she stepped forward, ready to face the approaching danger. The chase begins. The desert night was cold, a stark contrast to the scorching heat of the day. The stars above stretched endlessly, their light faintly illuminating the golden dunes. Luke sat by a small fire, watching Zira as she meticulously scanned the horizon. Despite her injuries, her movements were precise, her demeanor tense, as if every grain of sand carried a threat. "Are you going to tell me what's out there?" Luke finally asked, breaking the silence. Zira didn't look at him. "Hunters," she said simply. "Hunters," he stammered. "Like alien bounty hunters. What are they hunting?" Her eyes flicked to him, sharp as daggers. "Me." Luke swallowed hard. He had expected her to be some stranded traveler, not someone with dangerous enemies chasing her through the desert. "Why? What do they want from you?" Instead of answering, Zira stood abruptly, her gaze fixed on something far in the distance. Luke followed her line of sight, but saw nothing but shifting shadows. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "They're close," she muttered. "Too close." Luke's voice dropped to a whisper. "How can you tell?" Zira tapped her temple. "Enhanced senses. Their energy signatures are faint, but I can feel them." She turned to him, her expression grim. "If we stay here, we're as good as dead." The air around them grew heavy, an oppressive stillness settling in. Luke glanced at the horizon again, straining his eyes. Then he saw it, a faint glow, like a flickering flame, growing brighter by the second. His chest tightened as he realized it wasn't fire. It was something far worse. "They're here," Zira said, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "Pack your things. Now." Luke scrambled to gather his belongings, his hands shaking. "What are they? Robots? Aliens? What are we dealing with?" "Combat drones," Zira replied, her tone clipped. "Fast, deadly, and relentless." He froze. "Drones? You mean machines? How do we fight machines?" "We don't," she said, pulling a sleek, metallic weapon from her side, a blade that hummed faintly as she activated it. "I do." Before Luke could argue, the glow intensified, and 3 hovering drones emerged over the dunes. Their spherical bodies glinted under the moonlight, and their sharp, angular appendages bristled with weaponry. A mechanical whirring filled the air, and red lights flared to life as they locked onto their target. "Zira." "Stay down," Zira barked, stepping in front of Luke. The first drone fired, a bolt of energy zipping through the air. Zira moved faster than Luke thought possible, sidestepping the attack and slashing with her blade in one fluid motion. Sparks erupted as the drone shattered, its pieces scattering across the sand. The second and third drones swooped lower, encircling her. Zira spun, her movements a dance of precision and power. Another drone fell, but the third was quicker, firing a barrage of energy bolts. Zira deflected most with her blade, but one grazed her shoulder, forcing her to stumble. Luke's heart pounded as he watched. He couldn't just sit there while she risked her life. Desperate, he looked around for something. Anything that could help. His eyes landed on a pile of rocks near the edge of the firelight. Without thinking, he grabbed the largest rock he could lift and hurled it at the remaining drone. To his surprise, it struck the machine squarely, knocking it off balance. Zira seized the opportunity, lunging forward and driving her blade into its core. The drone emitted a high-pitched whine before exploding into a cloud of smoke and sparks. For a moment, there was silence. Zira stood amidst the wreckage, her shoulders heaving as she caught her breath. Luke approached cautiously, his hands still trembling. "You okay?" he asked, his voice shaky. She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "You shouldn't have interfered." "Interfered?" Luke repeated, incredulous. "I just saved your life." Zira finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And now you've made yourself a target." Luke blinked. "What do you mean?" "These drones," she explained, gesturing to the wreckage, "are linked to their operators. They'll know you were involved. You're no longer just a bystander, human. You're part of this now." Luke felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. "Great," he muttered. "That's just great." Zira turned away, scanning the horizon again. "We need to move. They'll send more, and next time, it won't just be drones." Luke hesitated. "Can't we hide? Maybe find some cave-ore." "There's no hiding from them," she interrupted. "They have resources, trackers, and numbers. The only way to survive is to stay ahead of them." She began walking, her steps steady despite her visible fatigue. Luke hurried to catch up, his mind racing with questions and doubts. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. As they moved deeper into the desert, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The cold night air gave way to a growing heat, and with it, an uneasy silence. Luke glanced at Zira, her determined expression unwavering. Whoever she was, whatever she was running from, one thing was certain: she wasn't just any ordinary alien, and now he wasn't just an ordinary traveler. The chase had only just begun. The warrior's secret. The sun blazed high above the dunes, painting the desert in waves of golden heat. Luke and Zira trudged forward, their silhouettes barely visible against the shimmering horizon. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty pressing down on them. Zira moved with determination despite her injuries, her eyes scanning the dunes for any sign of danger. Luke, on the other hand, struggled to keep up, sweat dripping from his brow as he clutched his nearly empty water flask. "Hey," Luke called out, panting. "Do you ever stop? I mean, I'm human. I need to breathe, you know." Zira paused, her expression a mix of irritation and reluctance. She turned to him, her silver skin glowing faintly under the harsh sunlight. "We can't stop for long. They'll catch up." Luke collapsed onto a rock, pulling the flask to his lips and draining the last few drops. They. Who exactly are they, Zira? You keep saying we're running from someone, but you won't tell me anything." She folded her arms, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer. But then, with a sigh, she sat down on the sand, the weight of her secrets pulling her shoulders low. "They're called the Krethar," she began, her voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "A race of warriors bred for conquest. They don't forgive, and they don't forget." Luke frowned. "And why are they after you?" Zira hesitated, her gaze dropping to the sand. "Because I betrayed them." Luke blinked, taken aback. "Betrayed them? What do you mean?" "I wasn't always like this," she said, gesturing to herself. "Once, I was one of them. A Krethar elite warrior. trained to lead invasions and enforce their will across the galaxy. Luke's jaw dropped. Wait, you were a soldier. For them? Zira nodded. Not just a soldier. I was one of their best, until I saw what they were doing. The destruction. The suffering. Entire worlds reduced to ash under their rule. Her voice hardened. I couldn't be part of it anymore. Luke leaned forward, his curiosity piqued despite the danger they were in. So, what did you do? I defected, she said simply. I stole something they wanted, something powerful, and fled. They've been hunting me ever since. Luke's mind raced as he tried to process her words. Something powerful. Like what? Zira's hand moved to the small satchel at her side, which she had kept close since they met. She opened it just enough for Luke to catch a glimpse of its contents, a glowing, crystalline object that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. This, she said, her tone grave. It's called the Heart of Antris. It's a relic from an ancient civilization, capable of harnessing energy on a scale you can't imagine. The Crethar wanted to use it to destroy their enemies. I couldn't let that happen. Luke stared at the artifact, a mix of awe and fear washing over him. That thing can destroy planets. Zira shook her head. It's not meant for destruction. It's meant for creation. The Crethar don't understand its true purpose, but they'll twist it into a weapon if they get their hands on it. A heavy silence fell between them. Luke couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration for her. She had risked everything to stop a force of unimaginable power, even if it meant becoming their enemy. So now what? He asked, his voice quieter. You're just going to keep running forever. Zira's jaw tightened. I'll run as long as I have to. As long as the heart stays out of their reach. Luke rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the horizon. You can't do this alone, you know. It's too big, even for someone like you. Her eyes narrowed. And what do you suggest? That I trust you to help me. A human. Luke met her gaze, the corners of his mouth tugging into a smirk. Hey, I just helped you take down those drones, didn't I? Besides, 2 heads are better than 1. Even if one of those heads isn't glowing. Zira let out a small, reluctant chuckle, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. You're stubborn. I'll give you that. Before Luke could respond, a sharp noise cut through the air. A mechanical hum growing louder by the second. Zira was on her feet instantly, her blade already in her hand. They're here, she said, her voice low and urgent. Get ready. Luke scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. Get ready for what? Zira turned to him, her expression fierce. To fight. Or to die. Luke swallowed hard, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had no idea how he'd ended up in the middle of an intergalactic manhunt, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. As the hum grew louder, Zira stepped forward, her blade glowing brighter with each step. Luke grabbed a sturdy stick from the ground, his makeshift weapon feeling pitiful in his hands, but he wasn't about to leave her side. Not now. Stay close, Zira said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. And try not to get yourself killed. Luke nodded, gripping the stick tightly. No promises. The dooms around them seemed to shift as the Crethar drones crested the horizon, their metallic forms gleaming under the sun. Luke felt his throat tighten as he counted them. 5 this time, each one larger and more menacing than the last. Zira's blade flared to life, and she charged forward without hesitation, a warrior in her element. Luke followed, his fear replaced by a strange, unshakable determination. The battle had begun, and Luke realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't just Zira's fight anymore. It was his too. The Alliance. The desert sun hung high in the sky, casting an oppressive heat over the landscape. Luke and Zira crouched in the shadow of a jagged rock formation, their breaths shallow and quick. Behind them lay the shattered remains of another wave of Crethar drones, their metallic husks scattered across the sand. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and ozone. Luke wiped the sweat from his brow. his hands trembling slightly. "So, this is your life?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Running, fighting, running again." Zira, her face set in a grim expression, didn't look at him. She was busy inspecting her blade, wiping off the dark, oily substance that passed as drone blood. "It's not a life," she said flatly. "It's survival." Luke leaned back against the rock, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. He couldn't deny the growing admiration he felt for Zira. She fought with a precision and intensity he'd never seen before, but there was a loneliness in her eyes, a burden she carried alone. "So what's the plan now?" he asked, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. "We can't keep doing this forever." Zira sheathed her blade and turned to him, her piercing blue eyes narrowing. "You're right. We can't. The drones are scouts. The Krethar themselves won't be far behind." "Fantastic," Luke muttered, rubbing his temples. "You know, for someone who's supposed to be a legendary warrior, you're not exactly overflowing with optimism." Zira arched an eyebrow. "Optimism doesn't win battles. Human." Luke chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, well, neither does dying in the middle of nowhere." Zira stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing a decision. Finally, she sighed and sat down beside him, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't ask for your help," she said quietly, "but you've proven useful." "Gee, thanks," Luke replied, rolling his eyes. "Glad to know I'm not entirely useless." "I'm serious," Zira said, her tone softening. "You've saved my life more than once now. That's not something I take lightly." Luke glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "Does that mean you're finally going to tell me what we're really up against?" Zira hesitated, then nodded. "The Krethar aren't just after me. They're after the heart of Antris. If they get it, they'll use its power to wipe out entire civilizations. You've seen what their drones can do. Imagine that on a planetary scale." Luke swallowed hard. "And you think we can stop them? Just the two of us?" Zira's lips curled into a faint smile. "I've faced worse odds." "Great," Luke muttered. "That's so reassuring." Zira leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Listen to me, Luke. I can't do this alone. The heart of Antris isn't just a weapon. It's a beacon. If we can activate it properly, it could call for help. Allies from across the galaxy. But I need time to figure out how to unlock its full potential." Luke frowned. "And in the meantime, we just keep running." "No," Zira said firmly. "We make a stand." Luke blinked, caught off guard by her sudden determination. "A stand? Here? In the middle of the desert? There's a canyon not far from here," Zira explained. "Narrow paths, high walls. It'll be easier to defend. If we can hold them off long enough, I can activate the heart and send out a distress signal." Luke shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "This is insane." Zira stood, her posture radiating confidence. "It's our best shot. And if you're still here, it means you've already chosen to fight." Luke hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. He could have left at any time. He could have turned his back on her and walked away from this whole mess. But he hadn't. Something about her, her strength, her resilience, her unshakable resolve, had drawn him in. "Fine," he said finally, pushing himself to his feet. "Let's do this." Zira nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "Good. Let's move." The journey to the canyon was grueling. The desert seemed endless, its heat relentless, but Zira pressed on without complaint. Luke followed, his body aching, but his resolve growing stronger with each step. When they finally reached the canyon, he was struck by its stark beauty, towering walls of red rock rising high above, casting long shadows over the narrow paths below. "This will work," Zira said, surveying the area. "We'll set up defenses here." Luke glanced around, skeptical. "Defenses? What defenses? All we've got are your sword, and, well, Me. Zira smirked, a rare glint of humor in her eyes. Then we'd better get creative. For the next several hours, they worked tirelessly. Zira used her blade to carve out traps in the rock, while Luke gathered supplies, loose stones, sharp debris, anything they could use to slow down the Crethar. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they sat together by a small fire, their work finally done. The canyon felt eerily quiet, the stillness heavy with anticipation. "You think this will be enough?" Luke asked, breaking the silence. Zira didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, her expression thoughtful. "It has to be." Luke nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and determination. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: he wasn't alone anymore. They were in this together. The artifact's trap. Night fell over the canyon, the sky above glittering with stars. The air was cool now, a welcome change from the brutal heat of the day. But the stillness of the desert was deceptive, masking the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. Luke paced nervously near the makeshift campfire, glancing at Zira, who sat cross-legged a few feet away. The heart of Antris rested in front of her, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. She studied it intently, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns etched into its crystalline surface. "You've been staring at that thing for hours," Luke said, his voice breaking the silence. "Any luck figuring out how to use it?" Zira didn't look up. The heart isn't just a tool. It's alive, in a way. It responds to intent, to purpose. But its creators designed it with safeguards, traps to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. "Traps?" Luke asked, frowning. "What kind of traps?" "Think of it as a test," Zira explained, her tone measured. "The heart will only reveal its true power to those it deems worthy. If I make a mistake, it could destroy us." Luke's stomach tightened. No pressure, then. Zira finally looked up, her expression calm but serious. "You don't have to stay. You've done more than enough already." Luke scoffed, shaking his head. "We've been over this. I'm not leaving." Zira gave him a small nod, her eyes softening. "Then let's hope we survive what's coming." As the first light of dawn crept over the canyon walls, a faint hum filled the air. Luke froze, his heart racing. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the distant whir of engines. "They're here," Zira said, standing and drawing her blade. She turned to Luke, her voice steady. "Stick to the plan. Delay them as long as you can while I activate the heart." Luke nodded, gripping the makeshift spear he'd fashioned from a broken drone part. "Got it. Delay. Try not to die. Easy." Zira allowed herself a small smile before turning her attention back to the artifact. Luke took his position near one of the traps they had set, his pulse pounding in his ears. The Crethar forces arrived with terrifying precision. Hovercrafts swooped low over the canyon, their lights cutting through the shadows. Troops disembarked, their armor glinting like polished obsidian. Their movements were efficient, calculated, as they spread out in search of their target. Luke watched from his hiding spot, his grip tightening on his weapon. He waited until the first group of soldiers stepped into the trap, a concealed pit filled with sharp spikes. With a sudden crash, the ground gave way beneath them, and their shouts echoed through the canyon. "Nice," Luke muttered to himself, a flicker of satisfaction cutting through his fear. But the victory was short-lived. More troops advanced, their weapons scanning the area. Meanwhile, Zira knelt before the heart, her hands hovering above its surface. The artifact pulsed in response, its light growing brighter. She closed her eyes, her breathing steady as she focused. "Guide me," she whispered, as if speaking to the artifact itself. "Show me the way." The heart responded with a sudden surge of energy, and Zira gasped as visions flooded her mind, memories of the heart's creators, their civilization, their purpose. It was overwhelming, almost too much to bear, but she didn't falter. She couldn't. Luke's voice broke through her concentration. Zira, we've got a problem. She opened her eyes just in time to see a Crethar commander stepping into the clearing. The figure was massive, clad in armor that radiated authority. In one hand, he held a weapon that crackled with energy. In the other, a small glowing device. Zira of the Crethar. The commander bellowed, his voice echoing through the canyon. You've run long enough. Surrender the artifact, and I'll consider sparing your life. Luke stepped forward, his spear at the ready. Yeah, not happening, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The commander's gaze shifted to Luke, a sneer curling his lips. And what's this? A human. You've fallen far, Zira. She's not alone. Luke shot back, his grip tightening. And if you want the artifact, you'll have to go through me. The commander laughed, a cold, hollow sound. So be it. The battle erupted in a blur of motion. Luke charged at the commander, his spear aimed at the towering figure. The commander swatted it aside effortlessly, knocking Luke to the ground. Before the final blow could land, Zira intervened, her blade clashing against the commander's weapon in a burst of sparks. Keep them off me, she shouted to Luke, her focus locked on the commander. Luke scrambled to his feet, using the chaos to lure the advancing troops toward the remaining traps. Explosions and shouts filled the air as he led them into narrow paths and ambush points, buying Zira precious time. Back at the artifact, Zira's struggle intensified. The heart flared brighter, its energy building to a crescendo. The visions in her mind became sharper, more demanding, as if the artifact itself was testing her resolve. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice trembling. A single word echoed in her thoughts. Trust. Zira's eyes widened. She realized the heart wasn't just testing her. It was asking her to let go of her doubts, her fears, her need to control everything. It wanted her to believe, not just in herself, but in those who stood beside her. Taking a deep breath, Zira placed her hands fully on the artifact. I trust you, she said, her voice steady. And I trust him. The heart responded with a surge of power, its glow enveloping the canyon. The Crethar forces paused, their movements faltering as the artifact unleashed its energy. The commander staggered back, his weapon falling from his grasp. Zira rose, her blade glowing with the same light as the heart. She met the commander's gaze, her expression unyielding. This ends now. Luke watched in awe as Zira charged forward, her every movement a blur of brilliance and precision. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. The tide had turned. As the heart's energy filled the canyon, Luke felt a strange sense of hope, like they might actually survive this after all. The final duel. The canyon was in chaos. The heart of Antris glowed brighter than ever, its radiant energy cutting through the smoke and dust that hung in the air. Crethar troops scrambled to regroup, their metallic armor glinting under the artifact's otherworldly light. Zira stood at the center of it all, her blade blazing with the same energy, her every movement purposeful and precise. Luke leaned against a rock, clutching his side where a stray energy bolt had grazed him. His chest heaved as he watched Zira deflect another series of attacks with an almost effortless grace. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, a force of nature, unstoppable and unrelenting. But then, the Crethar commander stepped forward. The commander was a towering figure, his obsidian armor etched with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with red light. His helmet resembled the skull of some long-extinct predator, and his glowing red eyes burned with fury. In his hands, he held a massive, double-bladed weapon that hummed ominously with energy. You've been a thorn in our side for far too long, Zira, the commander growled, his voice deep and metallic. Your defiance ends here. Zira stepped forward to meet him, her blade held steady. Your time is over, Karath, she said, her voice cold and unyielding. The heart of Antris will never be yours. Karath laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Luke's spine. Do you think this human pet of yours will save you? His gaze shifted to Luke, who was still struggling to catch his breath. Pathetic. Luke bristled but held his tongue. He knew he wasn't the warrior here. Zero was. Still, he tightened his grip on the broken spear he had salvaged earlier, ready to intervene if he had to. The duel began with a clash of blades that sent a shockwave through the canyon. Karath's strikes were heavy and brutal, each swing of his weapon designed to crush and destroy. Zira, by contrast, moved like a dancer, her every step calculated to deflect and counter. Luke could barely keep up with the speed of their movements. Sparks flew as their weapons collided, lighting up the canyon in flashes of red and blue. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the sheer intensity of their battle threatening to tear the very landscape apart. "You can't win, Zira," Karath taunted, his strikes coming faster now. "You're alone. You've always been alone." Zira gritted her teeth, deflecting a particularly vicious blow. "Not anymore," she said, glancing briefly at Luke. Karath sneered. "That human. He's nothing." "Maybe," Zira replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "But he's here, and that makes him more than you'll ever be." As the duel raged on, Luke realized that Zira was starting to falter. Her movements, once fluid and effortless, were becoming slower, her breaths more labored. The wound on her shoulder from their earlier battle had reopened, and dark, viscous blood seeped through her armor. Karath saw it too. "You're weak, Zira," he said, his tone mocking. "Just like all the others who've tried to defy us." Zira didn't respond. Instead, she pressed forward, her blade igniting in a burst of light that momentarily blinded both Karath and Luke. When the light faded, she was behind him, her weapon slicing through the joints of his armor. Karath roared in pain, staggering but not falling. Luke took the opportunity to act. He picked up a fallen energy rifle from one of the defeated Krethar soldiers and aimed it at Karath. His hand shook as he lined up the shot, but he forced himself to focus. This wasn't the time to hesitate. "Hey, ugly," he shouted, drawing Karath's attention. The commander turned, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You dare." Luke fired. The shot hit Karath square in the chest, sending him stumbling back. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it gave Zira the opening she needed. With a fierce cry, she leaped into the air, her blade slicing downward in an arc of pure energy. The weapon struck true, piercing through Karath's armor and into the ground below. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final guttural roar, Karath fell. The canyon fell silent, the Krethar troops frozen in shock. Without their leader, they seemed unsure of what to do. Zira didn't give them a chance to recover. She stepped forward, her voice echoing with authority. "Leave," she commanded, her blade still glowing. "Return to your ships and never come back." The troops hesitated, but the glow of the heart behind her was enough to convince them. One by one, they retreated, their hovercrafts rising into the air and disappearing into the horizon. When the last of the Krethar were gone, Zira collapsed to her knees, her blade extinguishing. Luke rushed to her side, ignoring the pain in his own body. "Zira," he said, his voice panicked. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I've been better." Luke helped her to her feet, his arm around her shoulders. Together, they turned to face the heart of Antris, which now pulsed gently, its energy calm and contained. "You did it," Luke said, his voice filled with awe. "You actually did it." Zira shook her head. "We did it." For the first time since they met, Luke saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Hope. A new legend. The canyon was eerily quiet after the battle. The Krethar forces had fled, their once imposing ships now distant shadows disappearing beyond the horizon. The only sounds were the faint hum of the heart of Antris and the occasional rustle of wind against the rocky walls. Luke and Zira stood together, their bodies battered but unbroken. Zira's hand rested lightly on the glowing artifact, her expression contemplative. She looked different now, not just the fierce warrior Luke had come to admire, but someone carrying the weight of an ancient responsibility. Luke, leaning against a rock for support, broke the silence. "So, is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Zira glanced at him, her silver skin glinting faintly in the light of the heart. "For now," she said, though her tone carried a hint of caution. "The Crethar won't stop, not as long as they think the heart is within their reach." Luke sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Great. So what do we do? Just keep running." Zira's lips curled into a small smile. "Not running. Preparing." Luke arched an eyebrow. "Preparing for what?" Zira turned back to the heart, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on its surface. The heart of Antris isn't just a weapon or a beacon. It's a message, a call to those who believe in something greater than conquest or destruction. Luke tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "A message? To who?" "To allies," Zira said, her voice steady. "If I can fully activate it, the heart will reach others across the galaxy, those who stand against the Crethar. Together, we can turn the tide." Luke stared at her, the enormity of her words sinking in. He had started this journey as a simple desert wanderer, and now he was part of something far greater. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's activate it." Zira knelt before the heart, closing her eyes and placing both hands on its surface. The artifact responded instantly, its glow intensifying as it pulsed with rhythmic energy. Luke watched in awe as the air around them seemed to shimmer, the ground beneath their feet vibrating gently. "Hold steady," Zira muttered, her voice laced with concentration. "The heart requires balance," intent matched with clarity. Luke didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway. "You've got this." The artifact flared brighter, and suddenly, a beam of light shot into the sky, piercing through the clouds and beyond. Luke shielded his eyes, his jaw dropping as the light began to take shape, a holographic projection of an ancient civilization. Towering figures with graceful features and flowing garments appeared, their voices echoing in a language Luke couldn't understand. What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Zira opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the projection. "The heart's creators. They left this message for moments like this. For those willing to stand against oppression." The figures spoke in unison, their words resonating with power. Though Luke couldn't understand them, he felt their meaning deep in his bones. Hope, unity, resistance. The light faded, leaving the canyon bathed in a gentle glow. Zira turned to Luke, her expression resolute. "The message has been sent. Now we wait." Luke frowned. "Wait for what?" "Reinforcements. Help." Zira nodded. "Yes, but also for the Crethar's response. They'll know the heart has been activated. They'll come for it, and for us." Luke ran a hand through his hair, a nervous laugh escaping him. "No pressure, then." Zira stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've already proven yourself, Luke. You're stronger than you think." He met her gaze, surprised by the warmth in her tone. I'm not a soldier like you. I don't even know how I got here." "You chose to stay," Zira said simply. "That makes you more than a soldier. It makes you someone worth fighting alongside." As night fell, the two set up camp near the heart. The artifact's glow provided a soft, comforting light, and for the first time in days, the tension between them eased. They sat by the fire, sharing the last of Luke's supplies, a small bag of dried fruit he'd been saving for an emergency. "So," Luke said, chewing on a piece of mango, "what happens after this? Assuming we don't get obliterated by the Crethar." Zira chuckled softly. "We rebuild. We find others willing to fight, and we make sure the heart stays out of the wrong hands." Luke nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You make it sound so easy." It won't be, Zira admitted. But nothing worth fighting for ever is. They fell into a comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Luke leaned back, staring up at the stars. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of peace. "Hey, Zira," he said after a while. "Yes. You think the galaxy has more people like you. You know, warriors willing to risk everything for what's right." Zira tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "I think the galaxy has more people like you, people who don't know they're warriors until they're tested." Luke chuckled, shaking his head. "Not sure if that's a compliment or an insult." "It's the truth," Zira said, a small smile playing on her lips. The next morning, as the sun rose over the canyon, they packed their belongings and prepared to move. The heart of Antris was secured in a protective casing Zira had crafted, its glow hidden but ever present. As they set out, Luke glanced back at the canyon one last time. It felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "So," he said, adjusting his pack, "where to next?" Zira glanced at him, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Wherever the fight takes us." And together, they walked into the horizon. Two unlikely allies bound by fate and purpose, a new legend just beginning to unfold.